Does God exist? It's an age-old question, but the answer is much simpler than you might think. If I tell a friend that something exists, like the screen you're watching this video on, how do I prove it? I simply show it to them, which incidentally also proves you have excellent taste in videos. The same logic applies to God. God can be imagined and justified in 1,000 ways, but the only effective way to prove his existence is to make him accessible to others. And the best way to make God accessible to others is to show him. What can be asserted without evidence can be dismissed without evidence. Now, over millennia, has anyone ever shown God? The answer, to this day, is no. There are, however, people who claim to have had direct contact with him, and that, in itself, is not in question. A real psychological experience remains real. The problem is something else. That experience is private by definition. I cannot access yours, you cannot access mine. And above all, people across cultures report equally intense and sincere mystical experiences of Allah, Christ, and the Buddha, and they contradict each other. If the method were reliable, it could not produce opposite results. Subjective experience, therefore, cannot serve as proof of an entity that claims to exist objectively. In the 1980s, neuroscientist Michael Persinger built what journalists called the God helmet. It applied low-intensity magnetic fields to the brain's temporal lobe. Subjects reported feeling presences, perceiving something greater than themselves, in some cases having visions. Not everyone, not always, but enough to raise an uncomfortable question. If that experience can be triggered by a magnetic field in a laboratory, what does it tell us about its origin? Not necessarily that God doesn't exist, but that our nervous system is, on its own, perfectly equipped to reproduce that sensation. No external entity is needed to explain it. So, am I an atheist? It might surprise you, but the answer is no. The problem with faith lies in the inability for believers to accept any form of refutation. For the faithful, and here I'd like to extend the term to all types of faith, from religious to political, refutation is unacceptable even in the face of evidence that calls the faith itself into question. I reject every form of dogma, and in that sense, atheism is dogmatic. If the Holy Maiden were to appear to me, I would certainly begin to believe, and that makes me not an atheist. If I'm not an atheist, then what am I? There's a distinction worth making, and one that is often ignored. Agnosticism is not where people end up when they haven't decided yet. It's not the exact midpoint between God exists and God doesn't exist, where one settles in comfortably waiting for new evidence. Agnosticism means one precise thing. I have no absolute certainty, and I recognize that absolute certainty is not available to anyone. Agnosticism is the philosophical position that holds that it is impossible for man to know whether God or metaphysical entities exist or do not exist. And not having absolute certainty does not mean that all hypotheses carry equal weight. I don't know with absolute certainty whether sentient dragons exist in the Amazon, yet I don't consider the possibility of their existence 50-50. Likewise, never having been shown God by anyone, I don't believe the arguments in favor of his existence are such as to make me suppose he exists. In the absence of evidence, the rational default position is not the center, it is the presumption of non-existence, with full openness to revision should evidence arrive. In reality, it's not God I'm addressing, it's myself. I was born somewhere in Catholic Europe, take a guess, and from childhood I was immersed in the rituals and everything that has to do with faith. As a child I believed deeply in what for me was a very strong bond with my homeland, my family, and my traditions. I believed and participated in all the rites that the part of the world I was born into had chosen for me, and I participated in the stories of my culture, in the ghosts that rise from graves, in giants and brigands, in the same way that I had believed in God. In my late teens, as is natural, I began to question my family and my origins. I saw that the world is simple. Ghosts don't rise from graves, giants when they appear are taken straight to the freak show, and brigands are put in prison. But when faith in ghosts disappears, a residue of anguish and indefinable melancholy remains. Faith, on the other hand, did not collapse. It dissolved slowly, almost imperceptibly, like something that stops making noise before you even notice the silence. There was no dramatic moment, no crisis, no burning disillusionment, no dark night of the soul, only convictions that, as they matured, led me to question myself. The point is not that I don't believe in God. The point is that I don't believe in anything with absolute certainty. In other words, I have faith in nothing. I stopped believing not only in God, but in the very idea that there is something to believe in definitively. I abandoned faith because at a certain point I realized I was living in a world that has no room for certainties. And realizing that you have faith in something and deciding to dismantle it is one of the most beautiful things that can happen to you. It applies to religion, to politics, to your own tastes. Testing yourself, dismantling yourself, getting lost, and continuing to get lost. Wandering without destination, in search of a non-existent meaning. This way of moving forward is the child of that small miracle in human history that was the birth of the scientific method. By studying science and investigating the world, I came to understand how it progresses, by trial and error, constantly questioning itself, accepting that what it knows is only a partial description of reality, always ready to tear everything down if necessary. In science, there are no certainties. There are descriptions of the world more probable than others, but none is established by an act of faith. Science simply describes the world to the best of our ability, without ever carving its ideas in stone, or at least it shouldn't. Planes fly because gravity is very probably true. If one day sufficient evidence arrived to dismantle it, we would abandon it without regret, and find a better description of why planes fly. I'm not saying science is the new God. It doesn't work like that. The scientific method is not a substitute for faith in the sense that it gives you the same certainties. It denies them to you deliberately. It tells you, the world is probably like this, we'll keep checking. And this, I'll admit, is not always comforting. There is something exhausting about living without a definitive answer. Certainty has a specific weight, a solidity, even when it's false. Removing it is like removing a floor. At first you fall, then you realize that falling is the right direction, that the only way to truly move is to accept not knowing where you'll land. That's why I stopped looking for a meaning that would hold forever. I started looking for descriptions that would hold until the next piece of evidence. So, why don't I have faith? My Lord, God is a hypothesis of which I had no need.